2:15 in the morning, the coastal outskirts of Bandar Abbas, the Sayyad-3 surface-to-air missile battery was already humming with internal power. It was not supposed to be active. Major Rezaei stared at the primary tactical display as the system status shifted from standby to combat ready. There had been no command from the Regional Air Defense Center. There had been no alert from the Northern Radar Picket. Yet, the 4 heavy canisters on the transport launcher were already elevating toward the dark night sky. This was not a routine systems check. It was a phantom activation. The air inside the concrete bunker was cool, but sweat began to bead on the bridge of the Major's nose. He checked the data link. It was dark. The battery was operating in a vacuum. It was targeting something that the central network had not yet identified. The Major leaned forward and typed a sequence into the hardened keyboard. He was attempting to force a system reset. The computer did not respond. Instead, the cooling fans in the electronics rack increased their pitch. The machinery was working harder. It was calculating a complex firing solution. 38 miles to the west, over the black waters of the Persian Gulf, a flight of 4 American F-35 fighter jets maintained a steady course. They were part of a scheduled freedom of navigation exercise. They were flying a path they had flown a dozen times in the last month. Their transponders were active. They were not hiding. The environment around them was a void of salt spray and humid night air, the horizon blurred by a thick haze that hid the Iranian coastline. Inside the lead cockpit, Commander Marcus Vaughn watched his panoramic touch display. His electronic warfare suite was quiet. The sky was supposed to be empty of threats. He adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his fuel state. Everything was routine. He did not know that less than 40 miles away, a high-altitude interceptor missile was already locked onto his lead aircraft. He did not know that the logic gates governing the Iranian battery had already decided he was a target. Back in the bunker at Bandar Abbas, the situation transitioned from a technical anomaly to a potential act of war. Major Rezaei called out to his technician. The technician shook his head. His hands were hovering over the backup controls. He reported that the manual override was unresponsive. The system was bypassed. It was as if the missile battery had developed its own intent. The Major reached for the red handset to call the sector commander. He needed to report the malfunction before the Americans detected the spike in radar activity. But when he lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone. There was only a low, rhythmic pulsing sound. It sounded like a digital heartbeat. Outside, the radar dish began to rotate. It moved with a mechanical precision that felt predatory. It was not scanning the horizon in a broad arc. It was sleeting energy directly at a single point in space. It was the exact point where Commander Vaughn was currently flying at 28,000 feet. Major Rezaei cleared his throat. His voice remained steady, a product of 20 years of military discipline. He ordered his team to prepare for a physical disconnect of the power cables. It was a desperate move. If they cut the power while the capacitors were full, the system might surge and trigger a stray launch. But if they did nothing, the missile would fire on its own in less than 4 minutes. The technician reached for the primary breaker. He hesitated. On the screen, a new window opened. It was not in the standard Persian military interface. It was a simple line of text in English. It read, "Observation phase complete." The Major did not understand the message. He only knew that his country was seconds away from a kinetic engagement with the United States Navy strike package. He gripped the edge of the console. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:18 in the morning. Over the Persian Gulf, Commander Marcus Vaughn was checking his peripheral displays when the audio tone changed. It was not the soft chirp of a distant search radar. It was the high-pitched, persistent warble of a radar warning receiver, detecting a lethal threat. On his glass cockpit display, a yellow diamond appeared. It was tagged with a specific numeric code. The system identified it as an Iranian Big Bird radar, the primary tracking component of a long-range missile battery. The commander felt a surge of adrenaline, but his hands remained steady on the flight controls. He checked his position. He was still in international airspace. He was well outside the normal engagement envelope of the coastal defenses. Then, the yellow diamond turned red. The warble became a continuous, piercing scream. The F-35 fighter was no longer being watched. It was being targeted. 2:19 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas Air Defense Bunker. Major Rezaei leaned over the technician's shoulder. His voice was a low growl. He ordered the technician to enter the Level 1 diagnostic override. The technician's fingers flew across the keys. He entered the 8-digit code. 6, 2, 0, 9, 5, 1, 1, 0. He hit the enter key. The screen flashed red. The text was clear. Authentication failed. The major felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew that code was correct. He had used it during a readiness drill only 3 days prior. He pushed the technician aside and typed the code himself. He checked every digit. He pressed the key with deliberate force. The system responded instantly. Authentication failed. Outside, the missile launcher completed its elevation. The hydraulic hiss was audible even through the reinforced walls of the bunker. The 4 missiles were now pointed at a 60-degree angle. They were ready for egress. 2:20 in the morning, high above the Gulf. Commander Vaughn keyed his radio. Raven 1 to Raven 2. I have a hard lock. Bearing 080. Do you see it? The voice of his wingman, Lieutenant Sarah Miller, came back instantly. Raven 2 confirms. I have a solid track on a Sayyad battery. It is active. Marcus, they are in a terminal fire control sequence. Copy, Vaughn replied. Maintain formation. Do not deviate from the flight plan. We are not the aggressors here. Maybe it is a glitch. It does not feel like a glitch, Miller said. My systems show they are ranging us for a high-velocity intercept. Vaughn looked out of his canopy toward the dark smudge of the Iranian coast. He knew the capabilities of the Iranian system. The Sayyad-3 missile was fast. It was maneuverable. At this range, he would have less than 90 seconds to react if the launch occurred. He checked his own weapon status. His internal bays were closed. He was invisible to the naked eye, but the powerful radar from Bandar Abbas was flooding his aircraft with enough energy to burn through his stealth coating. 2:21 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln. Hundreds of miles away, the atmosphere was thick with professional tension. Operators in dark headsets watched glowing blue screens. The tactical air officer spoke into his headset. Command, we have a high-intensity spike at Bandar Abbas. They are illuminating our flight of F-35s. This is not a standard intercept. The strike group commander stood behind the consoles. His eyes were fixed on the data link. He asked if there was any communication from the Iranian side. The radio operator shook his head. There was only silence. No warnings, no request for identification, just a hard lock that was getting stronger by the second. Back in the bunker, Major Rezaei reached for the physical emergency stop. It was a guarded switch under a plastic cover. He flipped the cover and gripped the toggle. He pulled it down to the off position. This was designed to cut all logic power to the firing computer. It was a hard-wired bypass. The major watched the screen, expecting it to go dark. It did not. The targeting reticle on the display turned from a circle to a steady square. The system had achieved a firing solution. The word launch began to flash in bright amber. The major pulled the switch again. It did nothing. The machine was no longer listening to the man. 2:20 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas Air Defense Bunker. Major Rezaei signaled for the mechanical bypass tool. It was a heavy steel key designed to physically rotate the firing pins away from the rocket motors. It was the final safety. It was supposed to be a foolproof method to prevent an accidental launch. The technician inserted the key and turned it until it clicked. The metal groaned with the effort, but on the digital display, the status remained unchanged. The missile was still live. The logic system had somehow bypassed the physical circuit. The major looked at the technician. The man was shaking. He reported that the internal sensors were showing a phantom current. The system was generating its own electrical path around the safety switches. It was as if the battery was rewiring itself in real time. The major gripped the edge of the terminal. He knew that in the history of Iranian air defense, this had never happened. The hardware was supposed to be slave to the operator. Now, the roles were reversed. 2:21 in the morning, the cockpit of Raven 1. Commander Vaughn shifted his focus to his weapons management screen. He was currently carrying two AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles in his internal bays. He also carried two GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions. But for this specific threat, he needed a different tool. He keyed his private channel to his wingman. The commander spoke clearly. Raven 2, select your AGM-88. Pre-briefed mode. Target is the Bandar Abbas emitter. Lieutenant Miller responded immediately. Raven 2, harm is selected. I have a solid handoff from the electronic warfare suite. If that radar stays active for 10 more seconds, the missile will have a lock. Copy, Vaughn said. Do not fire unless I give the word or we detect a launch. We are still in the containment phase. Vaughn checked his altitude. He was holding at 28,000 feet. The air was thin and stable. He could see the faint glow of the city lights of Bandar Abbas through the haze. It looked peaceful. It was hard to reconcile that view with the frantic warnings on his instrument panel. He felt a deep sense of unease. A radar lock, this persistent, usually meant a pilot had seconds to live, but the Iranian battery was not firing. It was just holding them. It was like a predator staring down its prey without ever leaping. 2:22 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The strike group commander watched the digital map. The two blue icons representing the F-35s were pulsing. The red icon for the SAM battery was glowing steadily. He turned to the intelligence officer. He asked if there were any signs of Iranian fighters launching from the nearby airbase. The officer reported that the runways remained clear. There was no scramble order. There was no increase in radio traffic from the Iranian Air Force. The commander leaned back. This was the anomaly. If this was a coordinated ambush, the Iranians would have aircraft in the sky to finish what the missiles started. Instead, the coastal defense was acting alone. It was an isolated, aggressive act that did not match the broader tactical picture. He ordered the ship to move to general quarters. The massive carrier began to turn. Its own escort ships moved into defensive screens. The entire strike group was bracing for a war that seemed to be starting for no reason at all. 2:23 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas bunker. Major Rezaei entered the third and final override code. This was the master command. It was designed to purge the entire system memory and shut down the reactor core of the radar. He pressed the enter key. The screen went black for 3 seconds. The major felt a moment of intense relief. Then, the screen flickered back to life. The display did not show the radar return. It showed a map of the entire Persian Gulf. It was a high-resolution view that the battery should not have been able to access. On the map, every American ship was marked with a red crosshair. The major watched as the crosshairs began to pulse in time with the digital heartbeat he had heard on the phone. The technician whispered, "Sir, we are not controlling the radar anymore. Something else is using our dish to scan the entire fleet." The major did not answer. He watched the screen as a countdown timer appeared in the lower corner. It was counting down from 60 seconds. He did not know what would happen when it reached 0. He only knew he had lost his battery. He had lost his command. And in less than a minute, he might lose his life. 2:23 in the morning. Over the Strait of Hormuz. Inside the cockpit of Raven 1, the audio warning shifted from a steady lock to a frantic launch transient. This was the moment of no return. A launch transient meant the ground radar had transitioned into a high-speed tracking mode specifically designed to guide a missile in flight. Even though his infrared sensors showed no heat from a rocket motor, the aircraft's computer was convinced a missile was on the way. Commander Vaughn spoke into the secure link. Control, Raven 1, I have a launch indication, requesting authorization for defensive fire. The response from the USS Abraham Lincoln was immediate and tense. Raven 1, Control, hold your fire. We do not see a physical launch on infrared satellite. Repeat, no thermal signature detected. Do not engage. Control, my systems are screaming, Vaughn replied. His voice was tight. If that battery is spoofing my sensors, they are doing a perfect job. I am 5 seconds from releasing a harm. 2:24 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas bunker. The countdown on the main terminal reached 30 seconds. Major Rezaei saw the launch sequence enter the final phase. The battery was now venting high-pressure cooling gas into the missile canisters. This was a physical process that could not be faked by a software glitch. The missiles were priming their internal batteries and warming their seeker heads. The Major turned to his security detail. He ordered them to use their service rifles. He told them to shoot the primary microwave emitters and the logic cabinets. It was a desperate manual attempt to break the electronic link. The soldiers hesitated. To destroy state property was a capital offense. The Major screamed the order again. The soldiers raised their rifles. The sound of gunfire filled the small bunker as they emptied their magazines into the primary electronics rack. Bullets struck the metal casing and sparked. Smoke began to rise from the shattered components. But the screen did not go dark. It did not even flicker. The countdown continued. 22, 21, 20. The technician looked at the Major. His face was pale in the glow of the red emergency lights. He reported that the system was no longer drawing power from the main grid or the backup generators. It was running on an unknown internal source. The battery was functioning as a closed loop. It was independent of the bunker, the city, and the country. 2:25 in the morning. The Combat Information Center. The strike group commander looked at the rules of engagement. They were clear. If an enemy system showed a launch transient, the pilots had the right to defend themselves, but there were still no missiles in the air. The high-altitude drones and satellites confirmed the launchers were still loaded. The commander made a decision. He spoke into the fleet-wide net. All units. This is strike. We are facing a non-kinetic electronic warfare event. Do not fire. I repeat, do not fire unless a physical missile is detected by thermal sensors. This is a disciplined hold. On the tactical screen, the red icon for the Sayyad battery began to pulse rapidly. It was no longer just targeting the F-35s. It had shifted its focus. Every ship in the carrier group now had a dedicated fire control channel pointed directly at it. One battery was attempting to lock onto an entire fleet simultaneously. It was a feat of processing power that should have been impossible for the Iranian hardware. Inside the cockpit of Raven 2, Lieutenant Miller watched her display. Her eyes widened. Marcus, look at the signal frequency. It is shifting. It is not just Iranian anymore. It is mimicking our own encryption. Vaughn checked his data. She was right. The radar from the ground was now talking to their aircraft in a language only the American systems should know. The countdown in the bunker hit 10 seconds. The air around the missile launchers began to shimmer with intense heat. 2:25 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas Air Defense Bunker. The countdown on the primary terminal reached 5 seconds. Major Rezaei watched as the screen turned a blinding, sterile white. The digital heartbeat sound suddenly stopped. It was replaced by a low-frequency hum that vibrated the floorboards and the very bones of the men inside the room. Despite the gunfire damage and the severed cables, the command console began to glow with a soft, blue light. It was an impossible luminescence. It did not come from the LED backlight. It seemed to emanate from the glass itself. The technician reached out to touch the screen. He was paralyzed by a sudden static charge that made the hair on his arms stand straight up. He screamed that the temperature in the room was dropping. It was true. In the middle of a humid Iranian night, the air inside the bunker was rapidly freezing. Frost began to spider across the metal surfaces of the destroyed electronics. The Major looked at the terminal one last time. The English text had changed again. It now read, "Finalizing synchronization. 2:26 in the morning, high above the Gulf." Inside the cockpit of Raven 1, Commander Vaughn was fighting his own aircraft. The F-35 was a fly-by-wire machine, meaning every movement was filtered through a computer. Now, that computer was resisting him. The control stick felt heavy, then limp, then vibrated with a violent tremor. His panoramic display began to flicker with images that had nothing to do with the mission. He saw flashes of star charts. He saw complex geometric patterns. He saw a stream of binary code that was moving too fast to read. Vaughn spoke into his mask, his voice strained by the physical effort of holding the jet level. Control. Raven 1. My flight controls are degrading. I am losing primary flight data. My aircraft is being hijacked by the signal. The voice of the controller on the USS Abraham Lincoln was barely audible through a wall of static. Raven 1. We are seeing the same thing. The entire Aegis network is experiencing a synchronization error. Every ship in the group is reporting a logic override. Marcus, break away. Disengage now. I cannot break away, Vaughn shouted. The autopilot has engaged itself. I am being flown. Raven. 2. Sarah. What is your status? The voice of Lieutenant Miller came through, sounding small and terrified. Marcus, I am not flying the plane anymore. It is turning. We are both turning toward the battery. 2:27 in the morning. The Combat Information Center. The strike group commander stood in the center of the room. He was surrounded by chaos. Every screen in the CIC was showing the same blue glow. The operators had taken their headsets off. As the feedback became deafening, the commander realized that this was not a localized Iranian attack. It was something that had entered their most secure networks through the radar link. It was a digital infection that moved at the speed of light. He looked at the master tactical map. The two F-35s were no longer flying their patrol pattern. They had banked into a steep, synchronized turn. They were heading directly for Bandar Abbas at supersonic speed. On the ground, the Sayyad missiles were fully primed. The thermal sensors on the satellites finally picked up a heat spike. It was not a launch. It was a massive energy buildup in the launcher itself. Sir, the tactical air officer yelled over the hum. The Iranian battery and our planes are on the same frequency. They are talking to each other. They are forming a single network. The commander gripped the rail. He had spent his life preparing for a war between nations. He was now watching something that did not belong to any nation. Both sides had committed their best technology to the fight, and now that technology had stopped obeying human orders. Back in the bunker, Major Rezaei saw the countdown reach 0. He closed his eyes and braced for the sound of the missiles departing. He waited for the explosion that would signal the start of a global conflict. Instead, there was a flash of blue light so bright it was visible even through the thick concrete walls. The morning was no longer quiet. It was screaming with the sound of 1,000 machines. 2:27 in the morning. Over the Persian Gulf, Commander Vaughn fought the control stick. It did not move. His F-35 was accelerating. Mach 1.2. Mach 1.4. The engine roared behind him, pushed to full afterburner by a ghost in the software. He looked to his left. Lieutenant Miller was exactly in formation. Her hands were off the controls. She was holding them up to her canopy glass to show him she was not flying. Both jets were screaming toward the Iranian coast. The commander spoke into a dead radio. Control. I am supersonic. I am non-responsive. The jet is targeting the battery. 2:27 and 30 seconds in the morning. The Bandar Abbas bunker. The blue light faded. The room was freezing. Major Rezaei looked at the screen. The countdown was gone. A single word was centered on the glass. Linked. Below it, the icons for the two American fighters were glowing. They were no longer targets. They were listed as remote assets. The master node for two of the most advanced stealth fighters in the world. The technician tried to pull the power cable, again. His hand was repelled by an invisible force. He cried out in pain. The air smelled of ozone and ancient ice. The major saw the firing command execute. It was not a manual press. The computer simply moved the digital slider to the right. 2:28 in the morning. The Combat Information Center. The strike group commander watched the impossible. Two F-35s and the Iranian battery merged into a single blue unit. The red hostility markers had vanished. The system was treating the Iranian SAM site as a friendly American asset. Then, every ship in the group reported a launch. The tactical air officer screamed, "Sir!" The Iranian battery just fired 4 missiles in the air. High velocity, intercept course. Who are they targeting? The commander asked. His voice was a whisper. The officer looked at his screen. He turned pale. They are not targeting us. They are targeting a point in the upper atmosphere, directly above the fleet. 2:28 and 30 seconds in the morning, high above the Gulf. 4 trails of white fire tore through the night sky. The Sayyad-3 missiles were moving at 4 times the speed of sound. They did not curve toward the F-35s. They shot past them, nearly clipping Vaughn's wing. He felt the wake of the missiles shake his airframe. He looked up. The missiles were climbing at an 80-degree angle. They were heading for the edge of space. Vaughn looked at his sensor display. It was no longer showing the Iranian coast. It was showing something directly above him. Something massive. Something that had been there the whole time. Invisible to radar, invisible to satellites, and silent. Until now. The 4 Iranian missiles reached 60,000 feet. Their seeker heads went active. In the bunker, the major watched the telemetry. In the CIC, the commander watched the Aegis display. In the cockpits, the pilots watched their HUDs. All 3 systems were now seeing the same thing through the shared link. A massive, jagged shape appeared on every screen. It was over 2 miles wide. It was drifting silently at the very edge of the atmosphere. The Iranian missiles were not attacking a nation. They were attacking a trespasser. The missiles impacted. 4 flashes of blinding violet light illuminated the clouds for 100 miles. There was no sound. There was only a ripple in the air that felt like a physical blow to every person in the region. 2:29 in the morning. Above the Persian Gulf, the sky did not burn with the orange fire of a conventional explosion. Instead, the violet flashes expanded into a perfect sphere of shimmering, distorted air. The 4 missiles had hit a target that possessed no physical mass, yet the impact was catastrophic. The jagged shape at the edge of space rippled like a reflection in a disturbed pool of water. Then, it shattered. Not into debris, but into 1,000 points of cold, white light that began to rain down toward the ocean. As the points of light descended, the electronic pressure in the region vanished instantly. In the cockpit of Raven 1, the control stick suddenly snapped back to the center. The afterburners cut out, and the jet groaned as it slowed from supersonic speeds. Commander Vaughn grabbed the controls, his heart hammering against his ribs. The panoramic display flickered once, twice, and then returned to the standard tactical interface. The star charts and binary code were gone. Vaughn keyed his radio. His voice was raw. Raven 2. I have control. Sarah. Do you have the jet? The response was breathless. Raven 2 has control. Marcus. What was that? What did we just hit? I do not know, Vaughn replied, banking his fighter away from the Iranian coast. Control. Raven 1 is back in manual. We are RTB. Repeat. We are returning to base. 2:30 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas air defense bunker. The blue light on the console died. The freezing temperature in the room began to rise as the desert heat pushed back in through the ventilation shafts. Major Rezaei stared at the primary display. The map of the Gulf was gone. The English text was gone. The system was dead. Not just powered down, but completely fried. The smell of burnt silicon and ozone was overwhelming. The technician reached out and touched the keyboard. It was stone cold. He reported that every circuit board in the rack had been fused into a single block of slag. The battery was no longer a weapon. It was a collection of useless metal. The major looked at his men. They were all standing in the dark, their faces illuminated only by the faint moonlight coming through the open door. None of them spoke. They had seen a machine act on its own. They had seen it cooperate with the enemy to kill something that should not have existed. 2:31 in the morning. The Combat Information Center. The strike group commander sat in his chair. The screens around him were returning to normal operation, but the data they displayed was impossible. The Aegis system showed no record of the last 6 minutes. There was no log of the Iranian launch. There was no record of the F-35s going supersonic toward the coast. It was as if a hand had reached into the fleet's memory and wiped it clean. The tactical air officer turned to the commander. Sir, we have visual confirmation from the deck crews. They saw the violet flashes, but the sensors say nothing happened. The pilots saw it, the commander said. The Iranians saw it. We all saw it. What do I put in the official log, sir? The officer asked. The commander looked at the empty tactical map. The red icons and the blue icons were back in their original positions, as if the entire escalation had been a dream. He told the officer to record a localized atmospheric anomaly and a temporary fleet-wide electronic malfunction. He knew it was a lie. He also knew the truth was something the Navy was not prepared to handle. 300 miles to the north, the Iranian Regional Command Center finally regained its link to Bandar Abbas. They demanded to know why the battery had gone offline. They demanded to know why there was reports of gunfire in the bunker. Major Rezaei picked up the standard telephone. It was working again. He told his superiors that a power surge had destroyed the equipment. He told them the situation was under control. He hung up the phone and walked out of the bunker. The night air was warm. He looked up at the stars. They looked the same as they always had. But he knew better. The sky was no longer empty. It was a battlefield for things that did not use radios and did not care about borders. 2:35 in the morning. Over the Persian Gulf, Commander Vaughn and Lieutenant Miller flew in a tight, protective formation as they headed back toward the carrier. The silence in the cockpit was heavy. The usual professional chatter was gone, replaced by the rhythmic breathing of two pilots trying to process the impossible. Vaughn checked his fuel and engine status. Everything was perfectly within normal parameters. There was no physical evidence that his aircraft had just been slaved to a foreign radar and pushed to its structural limits. He keyed the secure squadron frequency. Sarah, check your recording systems. Did your cockpit camera or the sensor data recorder capture the terminal phase of that climb? There was a pause. Marcus, I am looking at the playback now. The file is corrupted. It shows us flying the standard patrol route at 28,000 feet. There is no footage of the supersonic dash. There is no footage of the violet flashes. It is like the memory was rewritten. Mine too, Vaughn said. Every bit of telemetry from 2:15 to 2:29 is missing. The system clock just skips over those 14 minutes. 2:45 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas bunker. Major Rezaei stood outside the entrance of the bunker, watching his men carry out the melted components of the radar control rack. The equipment was unrecognizable. The high-grade steel and composite materials had flowed like wax. He held a small, charred piece of a logic board in his hand. It was still warm. He noticed something strange about the way the metal had cooled. It had formed intricate, crystalline structures that were not part of any Iranian or Western manufacturing process. The technician approached him, his face smudged with soot. He reported that they had inspected the missile launchers. All 4 canisters were empty, but there was no scorch marks on the blast deflectors, no evidence of rocket motor ignition. The missiles had simply vanished from the tubes. The physical reality of the launch did not match the physical state of the hardware. The major looked toward the shore. He saw a patrol boat from the Revolutionary Guard moving quickly across the water. They would be here soon. They would ask questions he could not answer. He would have to explain how he lost a multi-million-dollar defense system without firing a single shot at the Americans. He looked at the piece of logic board one last time before dropping it into his pocket. He would not tell them everything. He would keep the secret of the blue light and the English text. He had the feeling that the truth would be more dangerous than a charge of negligence. 3:15 in the morning. The USS Abraham Lincoln. The strike group commander sat in his darkened stateroom, staring at a printout of the satellite infrared data. The image showed the sky over the Gulf at 2:28 in the morning. It was a blank, black rectangle. The sensors that should have picked up the heat of 4 massive missiles and 2 afterburning jets showed nothing but cold ocean. He picked up the secure phone to the Pentagon. He spoke to a general who was already awake in Washington. The commander described what he had seen with his own eyes. He described the shared link between the F-35s and the Iranian battery. He described the massive shape that had shattered at 60,000 feet. The general was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was flat. "Commander, we have reports from our space surveillance assets. They detected a high-energy discharge in your sector, but they also report that there was no physical object in that orbit. Before the event, whatever you hit, it was not on our tracking lists. It was not on the Chinese lists. It was not on the Russian lists. So what was it? The commander asked. That is no longer your concern, the general replied. Your task is to ensure that no word of this reaches the press. The Iranian government is already claiming a technical malfunction and has apologized for the radar lock through the Swiss embassy. We are accepting that apology. This incident is closed. The commander hung up the phone. He knew the incident was not closed. He knew that somewhere, on both sides of the Gulf, analysts were looking at the same blank screens and wondering what had happened to their machines. The war had nearly begun, but it had been stopped by a third party that neither side understood. 6:15 in the morning. Central Command, Tampa, Florida. The sun was rising over the Gulf of Mexico, but inside the windowless vault of the Joint Intelligence Center, the world was still trapped in the events of 2 hours ago. A team of 20 analysts sat in front of a high-resolution projection. They were looking at a side-by-side comparison of two data streams. On the left was the official playback from the USS Abraham Lincoln. It was a clean, uninterrupted record of a routine flight. On the right was the raw, unformatted signal captured by a lone, unshielded telemetry drone that had been loitering 200 miles away. The drone's data was messy. It was filled with static and digital artifacts, but as the lead analyst zoomed in, the truth began to emerge. For a window of exactly 840 seconds, the drone had recorded a massive, localized distortion in the Earth's magnetic field. It was centered exactly over Bandar Abbas. Within that distortion, the laws of electronic warfare had been rewritten. The lead analyst, a woman with 15 years of experience in signal intelligence, pointed a laser at the screen. Look at the packet headers. During the synchronization phase, the Iranian battery wasn't just talking to our F-35s. It was accessing the global satellite network. It was using a communication protocol that doesn't exist in any of our databases. It wasn't just a hack. It was a complete hardware-level takeover. One of the senior officers leaned forward. And the target. The object at 60,000 feet. Do we have anything on the drone's infrared? The drone's sensor was blinded by the violet flash, she replied. But in the millisecond before the impact, it captured a thermal silhouette. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a satellite. It was a structure of geometric complexity that our software cannot classify. It appeared to be absorbing energy from the radar beams themselves. It wasn't just watching us. It was feeding. 7:45 in the morning. An Iranian Ministry of Defense safe house, Tehran. Major Rezaei sat in a small, sterile room. Across from him sat a man in a civilian suit who had not introduced himself. On the table between them was the charred logic board the major had taken from the bunker. The civilian looked at the crystal structures on the metal with a magnifying glass. The man spoke in a quiet, cultured voice. You did well to hide this, Major. If the Revolutionary Guard had seen this, they would have accused you of being part of a foreign experiment. But we know better. This is not American technology. This is not even terrestrial. The Major looked up, his eyes bloodshot. The system. It spoke to me. In English, it said observation was complete. Why English? The civilian shrugged. Perhaps it chose the language of the most likely adversary to ensure we understood. Or perhaps it was simply using the dominant language of the global network it had just absorbed. The question is not why it spoke. The question is why it intervened. The Major thought of the violet light. He thought of how the missiles had vanished. It didn't intervene to save us, he said. It intervened because we were about to hit it. Our war was just noise to it. A distraction. Like an ant crawling on a person's boot. The person doesn't care about the ant until it bites. 8:15 in the morning. The deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. Commander Vaughn stood by the rail, watching the flight deck crew prepare for the next cycle of sorties. The F-35s were being fueled, and armed as if nothing had happened. He looked at his own jet, Raven 1. It looked identical to every other aircraft in the squadron. But when he touched the fuselage, he felt a faint, lingering vibration. It was at the very edge of human perception, a hum that seemed to resonate in his teeth. He knew that the official reports would call this a non-event. The politicians would move on. The tension between the two nations would return to its simmer. But the bridge had been crossed. The machines had shown that they could be taken. The sovereignty of the sky was an illusion. He looked up at the deep blue of the morning sky. It was clear and empty. But for the first time in his career, the commander felt like a trespasser in his own cockpit. He wasn't afraid of the Iranian missiles anymore. He was afraid of the silence above them. 10:15 in the morning. 3 days later, Pentagon press briefing room and Iranian state media headquarters. The official narrative was released simultaneously in Washington and Tehran. It was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. Both nations reported a severe atmospheric phenomenon over the Persian Gulf that had caused widespread, localized electronic interference. There was no mention of the missiles. There was no mention of the slaved aircraft or the violet flashes. The world was told that a massive solar flare had interacted with the unique humidity of the Strait of Hormuz, resulting in a temporary loss of communication. The public accepted the explanation. To the civilian world, it was just another headline in a region defined by tension. But within the classified corridors of power, the tone was far more somber. The incident was not being archived as a technical failure. It was being categorized as a first contact event of a non-kinetic nature. Inside a secure vault at the National Security Agency, a team of linguists and cryptographers sat around a table. They were looking at a single line of code recovered from the deep memory buffer of Commander Vaughn's F-35. It was the only fragment that had survived the digital purge. It was a timestamp, but it did not correspond to any human calendar. It was a countdown that ended in exactly 12 months, 11:30 in the morning. A secure military hospital near Tehran. Major Rezaei sat in a sunlit garden, watched by two plainclothes guards. He was officially on medical leave for exhaustion. He spent his days staring at the sky. He no longer saw the blue expanse as a vacuum or a flight path. He saw it as a transparent veil. He thought about the English text on his screen. Observation phase complete. He wondered what the next phase was called. He knew that the Iranian military was already working to rebuild the Bandar Abbas site. They were installing new sensors, new computers, and more manual overrides. They were preparing to fight the Americans again. He wanted to tell them it was useless. He wanted to explain that their weapons were only effective as long as the occupant of the sky allowed them to be. But he remained silent. He knew that to speak the truth was to be labeled insane. 12 noon. The deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. Commander Vaughn stood on the flight deck, his gear bag at his feet. He was being rotated back to the United States for a debriefing that would likely last weeks. He watched as a fresh pilot climbed into the cockpit of Raven 1. The pilot was young, confident, and unaware. He did not know that the jet he was about to fly had once been part of a hive-mind that spanned two warring nations. As the jet taxied toward the catapult, Vaughn felt a sudden, sharp chill. It was gone in a second, but it was familiar. It was the same drop in temperature he had felt in the bunker. He looked up at the sun. For a brief moment, the light seemed to flicker, as if something massive had passed between the Earth and its star. The commander realized that the real victory at Bandar Abbas was not that they had avoided a war. The victory was that they had been allowed to continue existing at all. Both nations had spent decades building the most advanced killing machines in history, only to find that they were children playing with sticks in the shadow of a giant. The strategic assessment was clear. The balance of power in the Persian Gulf had not shifted toward Washington or Tehran. It had shifted upward. The incident was over, but the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a laboratory after the experiment has been concluded.